Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Given the strange and turbulent times that we are living through, Kurt and I decided to reach out to some of our favorite behavioral science researchers and practitioners to get their take on the novel coronavirus pandemic that is shaking the world.
These special edition episodes will explore a variety of different aspects of the crisis and our response to each of those aspects through a behavioral lens.
We know that you may feel overwhelmed by the crisis already. It seems every news story, every social media thread, every phone conversation that we have is focused on some aspect of the pandemic right now. While the news and updated information are essential, we're going to take a different tact. We want to try to understand the science behind our reactions and our behaviors and how science can help us cope and move beyond the current crisis.
In each episode, we talk with a different behavioral science expert and get their best thinking on an aspect of the crisis. So sit back, take a deep breath, and listen to our special series on behavioral science and the coronavirus pandemic. Our guest for the special edition podcast is Annie Duke. Annie is an author, corporate speaker, and consultant in the decision-making space. In 2018, Annie's first book for general audiences, Thinking in Bets, Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts, quickly became a national bestseller, and it landed on our Behavioral Grooves top 10 books for 2018.
It sure did. And as a former professional poker player, Annie won a World Series of Poker bracelet for it. And she is the only woman to have won a World Series of Poker Tournament of Champions and an NBC National Poker Heads Up Championship. Pretty remarkable. She retired from the game in 2012. So, she's kind of moved on from that. But prior to becoming a professional player, Annie was awarded a National Science Foundation Fellowship to study cognitive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania.
Annie is the co-founder of the Alliance for Decision Education, a nonprofit whose mission to improve lives by empowering students through decision skills education. She is also a member of the National Board of After School All-Stars and the Board of Directors of the Franklin Institute. This was Annie's third time on Behavioral Grooves.
Yay!
You can hear her in episode 31 and our 100th episode spectacular. And over the years that we've known Annie, we've developed a friendship with her. You'll be able to hear that in this episode as the dialogue is more conversational in nature. We were three friends sitting around and talking about this crisis. So without further ado, here's Annie Duke.
That there is something that we do have a little bit of control over, which is the death rate, which I know sounds a little bit weird because, the virus is as deadly as the virus is, except that we don't live in the 1600s where the virus is just going to kill because we can do stuff to make it so that the virus doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
So just simple things like if your fever is too high, we can drop fluids for you. If we can give you oxygen support. We could
put you on a respirator.
Vent you, right? Yeah. All of these things that can make it so that a virus that might otherwise be killing 5% of the population is killing less than 1% of the population.
Yeah.
And what they're seeing now is that in South Korea, which was prepared, is doing massive testing.
Yeah.
So they can quarantine off the people who have it. And they're keeping, that they're reducing the curve, right? Like they're keeping you below critical capacity. It looks like it's about 0.6% ish in terms of the death rate, whereas it looks like Italy is going to converge at about 4.4%.
Well, that's still significantly higher than just regular influenza.
Well, of course, but if you look at, I'm thinking about that toggle of do you keep the medical system underwhelmed or overwhelmed?
Yeah.
And when you have a medical system that can handle the capacity, it's still much worse than the flu, but you're talking about 0.6%.
Versus
4.4%. So this is something that is very frustrating to me, is that I think that people don't understand that when you're sort of modeling stuff, that there's a whole bunch of different things that you can put into the model. For example, do you smoke, right? These are all things where if somebody says, okay, the numbers out of South Korea are 0.6, that doesn't mean that it's 0.6 for you.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that it's 0.6 under all circumstances.
Yeah.
What it means is that, at least in the case of South Korea, it's 0.6 under the best like if you have the best circumstances occurring, things are as good as they're going to get today. It's at 0.6.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Right.
There's just all sorts of stuff. And then now, of course, what we're starting to see out of America is that millennials aren't so safe. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, that make Americans a little bit different than other people. One of the, and again, there's a lot of uncertainty around any of these things because, who knows, but one of the things that they think they might be seeing is that if your BMI is over 25, that's actually a risk factor. And we know that, I think, one of you can look this up while we're talking, but I think it might be 70% of Americans have a BMI over 25. That might be wrong, but I think it's something like that. So Americans happen to have higher BMIs than kind of the rest of the world, in the same way that Italians smoke a lot more than the rest of the world, which is, of course, another risk factor.
Yeah, Chinese too. So that's, it's one of the, actually a doctor friend of mine responded back and was like, this is, a bunch of crap from that thing. And he's like, Chinese smoke, every Chinese smokes and different things. And I'm going, okay, that adds to that fatality factor and probably a little bit to the hospitalization rates. But all right, take that into account. It still is cut those numbers in half. Cut 70,000
by the way,
down to 30,000.
Ask him what his BMI is.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Right, because apparently that really matters. And there's a whole bunch of stuff, like they're looking at, like, men seem to be more vulnerable than women, but that could be related to smoking because more men smoke than women smoke. It's just like none of this is particularly clear.
And again, looking at the age differences. So we're at the last I saw, above 80, it was still at 14% worldwide.
Oh, it's bad. Yeah.
I mean, that's playing Russian roulette. It's.
And I think they said that 40% of the hospitalizations are people under the age of 54.
Yeah. That's the CDC says that 71.9% of Americans over 20 are obese, which would be 30 BMI. So,
yeah, there you go.
Peter Attia, I don't know if you've heard of him, Dr. Peter, but he's been doing
I was on his podcast.
Oh, that's right. I saw that. He's doing this video series, which has been one of the best that I've seen because he gets into the science behind it. And again, he is such a, he thinks, then he's like, oh, well, this is not quite sure, but this is he talks about the potentials and different facets of this. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see how this all goes. So
thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go check him out because I definitely like the way that he thinks.
Yeah, he thinks he is a good, again, just the way that he works through things is really interesting to me. So
there's a few things that have been, some mix of frustrating and, exposing, like, the need for actually communicating properly to people. So some mix between the two. And there's a few. I think one is that I think this is just a really good example of the fact that people kind of really don't understand hedging very well. And not only do they not understand hedging, but it's particularly hard to get people to put hedges in place when you're asking them to do something where the quality of the decision to hedge isn't already baked in. So let me explain it. And I actually talk about this in my book that's going to come out in September. So here's, just for people who don't know, like, here's a simple hedge. Like, I buy homeowners insurance, which includes fire insurance. It costs me some small amount of money. But what I'm really trying to do is protect myself from the impact of the downside, because I've got this risk, which is exposure to this sort of the left tail. Let's call it the left tail, where sitting in that left tail is my house burns down. Mm-hmm. And if I understand that under circumstances where my house burns down, this is going to have a huge impact on my financial life, I can pay something now in order to mitigate that risk and mitigate the impact of the downside. So it's a way to de-risk. So the interesting thing about homeowners insurance is that, and this is true of all hedges, is that you're trying to mitigate the impact of the downside, right? So you're trying to mitigate the risk. It's going to cost you something to do it. Mm. And this is the really interesting thing about it. You hope you never have to use it. Mm. So this is true of all hedges, right? So you're crossing your fingers, like I'm going to put this hedge in place, but I never ever want to have to use it. So when you're talking about something like homeowners insurance, where hopefully you end up never having to use it, people don't do any resulting in that case, where when you don't use it, they don't regret having had the insurance. And I think the reason why is that it's a pretty status quo decision at this point, right? Like there's just a lot of consensus around this is the sensible thing to do. And in fact, if you have a mortgage, the lender is going to force it on you.
Yep.
And so I think people are just like, okay, we really understand, like, this is clearly a good decision because like it's something everybody's doing and the mortgage company is making me do it. But when you do something when you're hedging in a way that where the quality of that decision isn't baked in, when you don't actually have to use the hedge, and by use, I mean, like call the insurance company, because obviously the minute that you put the hedge on, you're using it. Mm-hmm. But let's use the word use in sort of the colloquial sense as opposed to the technical sense. Then what happens is people regret having had the hedge in the first place. They feel stupid for having it. So the example that I would give there would be like, I want to have an outdoor wedding. I'm really concerned about the risk of bad weather. I absolutely don't want to make the choice to go move the wedding inside because what I want is an outdoor wedding. And so I pay to have a tent set up. Mm-hmm. This is a hedge. And then when the weather's great, I regret having bought the tent.
Yeah.
Same thing with, I've got to get to a flight. I cannot miss it. I leave an extra hour in order to get there on time, just in case there's traffic. So I'm trying to mitigate that. And if I get to the airport and there was no traffic, every single person on the planet regrets having left early. They're like, why did I do that? That was so stupid, right? So this is kind of this paradox around hedging. So I found this happening with people over and over again when it came to this. So just in terms of the social distancing, right? Like you're going to tap elbows and people are like, really? Do you think so? Like, come on, I'm a handshaker.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to look stupid for having done these things. Like I was going to restaurants last week or, before I went into lockdown on Thursday, and I've got my Lysol wipes with me and I'm wiping everything down and people are looking at me like I'm insane. And I think the reason is that it's like nobody wants to look dumb. Nobody wants to be like, I spent a couple of weeks wiping everything down with Lysol and it turned out this was nothing. And boy, do I feel stupid. Yeah. I was tapping elbows with people and man, now I feel like an idiot. I canceled my vacation and now I feel really dumb. And I feel like until the world is so clearly telling you that it's a good decision, which is too late, people are very reluctant to do these things where they feel like if there's a whole range of outcomes that occur, some of which where that hedge really gets exercised and some where it's just sitting in the background mitigating the risk and maybe you don't really see it. And we know there's this range of outcomes between 2 million people are dead and whatever. And in the case where it turns out not to be so bad, people will feel stupid. And so therefore they don't put the hedge in place until it's too late and it's obvious. So I think that's on a personal level. But then what was very frustrating to me was I feel like on a governmental level, I was at a conference, I think it was 3 weeks ago. It was the last conference I went to.
Okay.
It was about 3 weeks ago. And they asked me, like, what's the single thing that you wish had been done differently? And I said, tests being manufactured in January. Mm-hmm. Just start stockpiling tests because we could see very clearly what was happening in China by that point. By the end, when was the first case in Italy? I think it was right around the beginning of February, maybe.
I believe so. I'm not sure exactly.
I don't remember. Yeah.
But you could start to see that it was spreading. We already, by this point, China wasn't able to cover it up. And, we could kind of see what was going on there. And certainly by mid-January and definitely by late January, we could start to see what was going on. Because I remember I did go to a conference in January and I joked to people, that was when I got sick with what I still have the cough from. And I joked to people, don't worry, it's not coronavirus. And I remember making that joke, which I kind of regret now because it feels a little insensitive to me now. But at that point, it was still so abstract.
Yeah.
But at that point, so I know January 4th, it was definitely January 24th, it was for sure a thing. It was enough of a thing for me to be thinking about it, right?
And if the government would have had experts that were, modeling this out and looking at this and saying, yes, this could be, again, it was, there isn't enough data out there to actually say for sure. But to your point of hedging, right? from the U.S. perspective, building out test kits at that at a big
such a
piece
small
up there?
cost. It's such a small cost, and compared to GDP, whatever. And the interesting thing about those test kits is it was almost sure that they would not go to use.
Yeah.
Because even if we managed to contain it here, other countries were going to need those test kits, and it behooves us to make sure it's being controlled in other countries regardless, right?
Yeah.
You know, one thing I think about with hedging is that sometimes the cost of a hedge is so small that you're essentially in a free roll situation, what I would call a near free roll situation. So I think free roll is a word that's kind of a little bit confined to gambling. Hopefully after my book, it'll become more widespread.
Well, you've talked about it with us before, so there you go. Maybe everybody listens to behavioral groups.
Right. So just to reiterate what a free roll is, when you're thinking about the range of possible outcomes, there are certain decisions that you can make that where the downside is really, really, really limited, but the upside potential is huge. So the way that you can think about a free roll is just ask yourself this question. If this works out in the worst way possible, am I any worse off than I was before? So a simple example of a free roll is you see a house that's out of your price range, because realtors do that. Should you make an offer on the house that's within your price range? A lot of people won't do it because they're like, no, because they're not going to offer it. They're not going to accept it anyway, so on and so forth. And they don't want to be embarrassed or think that the homeowners were insulted or, or whatever. But of course you should offer on it, because if they don't accept, you're literally no worse off than you were before you made the offer. Cost you a tiny bit of time.
Yeah.
So, and then you can also have negative free rolls, obviously. I would put like speeding in that category. Like you're going to save 3 minutes, but you might die. So that would be a negative free roll.
Or kill somebody else.
Or kill somebody else.
Well, are there differences between, some of these have very specific calculative results or impacts on our lives. Some are more just social. I mean, you talked about some have to do with social norms, right? The whole, elbowing versus a handshake. I might feel stupid from that, from doing that. But it's hard for me to put the calculations together as to what the actual outcomes, might be.
Well, I think that sort of brings up, so from a policy perspective, I would have to think that the policymakers would understand that the cost of producing kits is super low compared to the mitigating the downside, what you're going to gain from having done that. So I would put that in a near free roll category, because if you compare the cost of producing all those kits to GDP or even say to our national debt, right? Like it's essentially free. Like it's basically free, at which point it really does become a free roll, right? Like if we don't use them, who cares? We're not really worse off than we were before. If we do use them, boy, there's just like humongous upside associated with that. In terms of what you're talking about, I talk about this actually didn't make it into the new book, because sadly a 30,000 word book turned into a 60,000 word book. But so at some point I had to cut some stuff, but that's all good, because my editor's very happy that it ended up longer than we thought it was going to be.
Okay.
Bravo.
And I also want to say you helped me through like a very dark period where I couldn't kind of find the voice of the book. So thank you guys.
Oh, you're welcome.
Because I did find the voice, and I know that you've read it in the voice that I managed to find, which frankly was my own voice.
Which was great, by the way.
How about that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, and you guys were very clear. I was trying to solve a problem, and I ended up becoming very regimented in the way that I was dealing with it. You guys were very kind to point out, this doesn't sound like you. And I was like, okay, so perhaps I should make it sound like me. So that was all good. But at any rate, this ended up on the cutting room floor. But one of the things I like to think about is the interaction. So obviously, I'm like the resulting lady. So resulting doesn't occur under all circumstances. Resulting occurs, there's an interaction between whether a decision is status quo or consensus versus innovative or non-consensus, and whether you get resulting or not. So if we go to the beginning of thinking in bets, right? So we have Pete Carroll does this thing, passes the ball. It's intercepted. I mean, well, Pete Carroll personally doesn't pass the ball, but whatever.
He sends the play in.
He makes the call. He makes the choice. Yeah.
It's intercepted, and the world comes down on him. Now, there's a consensus play there. The consensus play is to hand it off to Marshawn Lynch and run the ball. So that's the consensus play. The non-consensus play is what Pete Carroll did. Call a pass play. And now you notice when it turns out horribly, everybody's like, you're the biggest idiot ever. Now we know if that ball had gotten caught for a touchdown, if it had been complete, he would have been hailed as a genius. Okay, so you can see that you end up at these extreme reactions in a case where the play is unexpected. But let's take the expected play. So I'll do this thought experiment with you. So he hands the ball off to Marshawn Lynch, and Marshawn Lynch fails to score. And that's how they lose the game. Is he a genius or an idiot in that case? I don't think he's either. If he wins the game, handing it off to Marshawn Lynch, it's like he's a great coach. There's no like 2 years later talking about the best play of Super Bowl history or something.
Yeah.
Whereas if he passes the ball and it's complete, then it's 2 years later, 3 years later, it's the best play of Super Bowl history, but not if he wins by handing off to Marshawn Lynch, but the reverse is also true. So if he hands it off to Marshawn Lynch and they lose that way, it actually rolls right off of Pete Carroll's shoulders and on to Bill Belichick. Mm-hmm. Bill Belichick's defense is great. The Patriots defense held. So what we can see is we can think about this 2x2 matrix now. If you have a status quo decision that works out well, it's like, good job. Like you went through a green light and you didn't get in an accident. Yay, you.
Yeah.
If you have a status quo decision or a consensus decision that works out poorly, it's like, that was really tough luck. Sorry. But it's not your fault. Like the Patriots were just too good. Like, what are you going to do? Right. So now if you have a non-status quo decision, a non-consensus, an innovative decision, something that's very unexpected, and it works out in your favor, it's genius with 17 exclamation points. If you have an unexpected or non-status quo decision that turns out poorly, it's the Pete Carroll treatment. It's idiot with 17 exclamation points. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is that we as decision makers know this.
Yeah.
So our decision making actually we get into this very defensive crouch when we're making decisions to try to avoid being resulted upon. This has all sorts of implications for leadership, but we can talk about it in terms of just coronavirus today. So what happens is that we will have a tendency to want to stay on the beaten path and not stray from it, because we understand that if we stay on the beaten path, then we're not going to get blamed for when it goes poorly. Now, you might say, yeah, but we don't get the chance at genius either, but it's like we all know there's an asymmetry there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like we don't really, getting the genius doesn't feel as good as getting the idiot feels bad.
It's a loss aversion.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that we can see this interacted, I think, really badly with what was happening with coronavirus, because you're asking people to change what they normally do. You're asking people to behave in ways that look kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
That aren't status quo. And it's very hard to get people to do that unless they feel like there's a lot of consensus that decision is good. Because what is very hard for people to understand is that when you're doing those behavior changes, you're thinking about the range of possible outcomes, right? So there's a whole set of outcomes that you can observe that are possible to observe, but there's only going to be one that you do observe. And if you don't give them certainty that those downside outcomes are going to be the one that they observe, it's very hard for them to do these things that are non-status quo because they're afraid that they're going to look like idiots.
There was, and I don't know who said this. I believe it was one of the gentlemen from the CDC who was talking about, if we do these things a week before the pandemic starts, you're seen as crazy. If you do them a week after the pandemic starts, you're seen as an idiot. Right. And there's like this really short
because there's
window.
a shift, right? There's a shift in what's consensus now.
Yeah.
So what happens is that at some point, the numbers become big enough that you have certainty that the downside is being realized. You have certainty that you're observing the downside. Now, under those circumstances, you can now change. Now people will change their behavior because they understand there's no possibility anybody's going to say to them, that's really weird that you're carrying around a box of Lysol wipes and you have Purell all over your body.
Or that you're not shaking my hand, that you're offering up an elbow, that you're...
Because you've already realized the downside outcome, so you've taken the uncertainty out of the equation. The reason why we will stay in the status quo groove, we won't climb out of that trench, is because of the uncertainty. Because it could turn out great, it could turn out poorly. And what we're trying to do is protect ourselves against being told that we're dumb because it didn't turn out the way that our behavior would have protected us against.
It's interesting. So last week I flew down to business in Chicago. And so it was, a couple different companies, meetings, and I was with a salesperson that was working with me. And when we were together, is like we were using the elbow to push the elevator number, and we were wiping things down and doing things. But once we got into the meetings, and people are coming in and they're offering their hands out at that point, right? Our behavior changed. It was like, oh, I better accept this because it's a client.
And
or
you saw that
client.
happen do you remember the Rose Garden press conference with all of the people, and Trump is putting his hand out to shake and everybody is shaking back except that one guy.
Yeah.
Remember that one guy was like, yo, right? So he was willing to break the social norm, but that was really unusual.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of that's sort of the problem that we get is, are we willing to change our behavior if it turns out that the behavior change was unnecessary? And by unnecessary, again, going back to the idea of hedging, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have had that hedge in place. It just means that your house didn't burn down.
Right.
Right. And that's where we really kind of get into these, there's all sorts of things that happen. So that's kind of the thing number one, is that it's made me, I've been thinking about these hedges and how does that interact with status quo versus non-status quo, expected versus unexpected. And, if all of a sudden there was some like new type of insurance you could buy that like nobody had bought before, and it was protecting against some very rare event that occurred, but the rare event was ruin, literally ruin, people wouldn't buy it right away. It would take a while for that to change. It's actually the same problem that coaches in the NFL have had in the past, or coaches in the NHL have had. So in the NHL, it's when do you pull the goalie? Mm-hmm. And in the NFL is, do you go for it on fourth down, right? And they're still pretty bad, but like take 5 years ago when they were horrible at it. What you saw was that the consensus decision was punt.
Yeah.
So regardless of what the analytics were telling anybody, because the people in the stands can't see the analytics, they can't see the range of possible outcomes and they can't see the win probability moving up or down. They just can't see that. All they can see is either you gained the yards that you needed, or they just took the ball over on the 40 and the other team got to score a touchdown. Yeah. So all they can see is the outcome that actually occurs, the one that you actually observe. And so what happened was that they knew that if they failed by punting, nobody was going to say boo.
Right.
But if they failed by doing something that was really against the grain, certainly 5 years ago, very against the grain by going for it on fourth down, then it was going to be like, you're fired, right? You're an idiot. And this has been the problem, I think, with Corona and sort of putting these things in place. What's interesting with the NFL is even though they're getting better, you can still see the influence of this problem, this 2x2 matrix, because what happens is that when they don't go for it, they usually have a variety of things that tell you why there's a good narrative to tell. Consensus wasn't going our way. The running back wasn't whatever, quarterback. And
all of it justifying the social norms, basically.
Right, which is to go back to punting, right? It's to get you back to what's more status quo. What you never hear is, I know the analytics said we shouldn't do it, but.
Yeah. So in NFL, NHL, all of those, you have the sportcasters who then the journalists who write about things, and so their view of this is, again, they're going to talk about that, right? If you go for it on fourth and you miss it, and then the other team scores, that's the talking point the next day, right? Yep. In government, there's also the pundits, right? And you get the 24-hour news stations. So it's that aspect as well. So they're looking at that consensus piece as status quo, and like going out beyond that is, again, being brought to the front of people's attention much more so than, say, you or I doing something along that line, where it's still hard enough for us, but we're not having that extra spotlight even put on it. So.
Right. I completely agree. And I think that was the real shame of not having the testing kits in place. Mm-hmm. Because if you're looking at what are the types of things that we're going to have to put in place, all of which are hedges against 10 million people worldwide dying, right? Mm-hmm. They escalate depending on when you get the hedge in. So you can think about it this way. Like this is a simple way to do it. If you build a brand new house with great electric and you ask for insurance at that moment, that insurance is going to cost a lot less than if you ask me to insure your house when there's a flame that's already lit.
Yeah.
And you might be able to put it out or not. Right. But now maybe the insurance initially would have cost you $50 a month. And now I'm going to ask you to pay me 80% of the value of the house or more, right? Like it depends. I've got to figure out like what's the probability that you can actually get this fire out at this point, right?
Exactly.
So as we get closer up on the actual thing that you're trying to hedge against occurring, like as we get more certainty around the downside actually realizing, the hedge is going to be more expensive. So we can think about that with coronavirus, right? If you can do some stuff early on, like test kits, those are relatively inexpensive. But if you don't get or social distancing, right? Just really putting out message about social distancing and doing your darndest starting in January, right? As opposed to in March to say, stand 6 feet away from people, like let's start having half the people come in and half work from home, and these things that are relatively low cost. To have half your workforce working from home is not that huge a cost. But you can do some things that are lower cost. If you allow the house to already be on fire, it becomes very expensive and it's shutting the economy down, which is where we actually ended up. So what I think is, so if you look at South Korea, of course, we have, as you know, we have a tendency to believe, it's the last disaster syndrome, right? But the reason why the last disaster syndrome matters is because we when we're thinking about what the possible outcomes are and how things might go wrong, the way that things have gone in the past, this is just status quo bias, we tend to assign those higher, we think those are going to persist. So what I think is kind of interesting is that this country really wasn't affected by SARS.
Yeah.
And so we weren't particularly like worried about like, oh, what if a coronavirus comes and gets us? But Asia was. Mm-hmm. They had all of those things in place already, right? Like they I think it was something that they have like twice as many or maybe a little bit more beds per capita than we do in terms of hospitals. Certainly more respirators per the population. They were much quicker with testing. China aside, I'm talking about South Korea here. Yeah. And I think it's because the social, you didn't have to go against the social tide because they'd already experienced SARS. And so they were much more willing to get in there quickly with the cheaper hedge. Yeah.
China has special fever rooms where, when they go and they test and you have a fever, you get sent specifically to a fever room where then you start doing testing. So it's separate from the rest of the hospital. It might be part of it, but it's a separate entrance. Everything else about it, it's all quarantined off. And then once you get, diagnosed, you go to quarantine right away. And so they have those set up and in place.
Right. And there's a cost to those things.
There is. There's a definite cost to them.
And it's a hedge.
Cost to those things. Right. Exactly. But there's a reason why you're willing to pay that cost up front. Right? So that you're not going to the insurer and saying, well, the staircase is on fire. I think I can get it out. Yeah. But how much do I have to pay right now to insure my house?
Hey, right? Just for chance, I got this little fire going, but there's an aspect of this though that is making decisions under uncertainty, right?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's the whole thing, isn't it?
That is the whole thing of this. But so what can we do in order to help ourselves make better decisions in this situation, given all of the uncertainty that is out there? What is it that we, the listeners of this podcast, that Tim and I can do to help us make better decisions in this really weird and crazy time?
Yeah, so I think in general, it kind of goes back to what I was saying, that people really wanted a lot of certainty around the downside realizing. Mm-hmm. Before you were really, really willing to make these kinds of changes, where had people been much more comfortable with thinking about the future as a range of possible outcomes and how would you actually, what would you have wanted to do? You can sort of imagine it sort of in a pre-mortem way, right? Like if you knew that the virus was going to take hold, what would you have wanted to do 2 months ago that would have stopped this from happening? But that requires that you're acting on something that may never occur. So that's the issue with uncertainty. And obviously you're talking about a wide range of possible outcomes. And then in this particular case, there's lots of uncertainty piled onto that, which is that there's just a lot of information we don't know. So even if it were the case that we 100% knew everything that we needed to know, and we knew exactly what all the bins were, meaning, here's the probability that 10 million people die, 5 million people die, 2 million people die, one person dies, you would still want to be thinking about, okay, so let's say that we knew that we hit the left tail, the worst case scenario. Now let's think back to why did that occur? Mm-hmm. And when you think about why did that occur, some of in there is going to be things you didn't do.
Yeah.
Right. And then you do the flip thing, which is a backcast, which is, let's say we knew that the right tail was going to occur and very, very few people were going to die from this. What are the things that probably happened that made it so that we ended up in this position? And that's where you're going to see things like, well, you had testing ready and you had, right. So now we can actually create a full picture of the way that we would want to act. But what it means is that you have to be willing to, some percentage of the time, have a warehouse full of unused test kits.
With that, though, does it also come into, this idea that this is a black swan event, that it's so outside of the norm that this is not in our realm of thinking about the potential. So back in January, yes, we saw it over in China, and there's this little bit, and I think some of the experts are probably there, but for us, me as a individual, as you said, SARS did not come over here to the United States. So don't have that experience. So it seems so distant to me that the idea of social distancing at that time, or even going through the exercise of saying, all right, this could be something, isn't there. I mean, does that play into this as well? I mean, just the availability bias that we have for considering that this could even be a potential issue?
Well, I think that it does. And, there's going to be some individuals who kind of can see what's going to come, but that's why it's really a policy question. Right. So if you have people who really understand how you would forecast these events and can be communicating much earlier. Look, you as an individual can't create a warehouse full of test kits, right?
That's true.
Not on you. So I think that's really the issue. And what I see across all decision making is kind of twofold. One, and I think that it interacted here in a bad way. I think thing number one is that people are searching for a level of certainty that you cannot get in these circumstances, right? Mm-hmm. Even if the only influence were luck here, people would have trouble with it, but we also don't know a lot. So we've got, this is really sort of the maximum situation where you're just dealing with subjective probabilities. If we had perfect information, the probabilities would be objective. And we could say like, okay, this percentage of the time, 5 people are die, this percentage of the time, 5 million or people are going to die. And let's sort of do the cost benefit analysis and figure out what we can do to mitigate and so on and so forth. But in this particular case, we're dealing with subjective probabilities. And I think that people just really have trouble understanding how to make decisions under those circumstances. And what they want to do is get really sure. And I think that that's what you saw with people's behavior, was that when they started seeing the exploding numbers, that was when they were like comfortable with being sure that, yes, you should go into your house. And I guess if you're on spring break, you're still not sure enough, but whatever. So as a society, I think number one is that we need to get people more comfortable with thinking that way, that the world is not deterministic in nature. And that a lot of times your most valuable resource is time. And any time that you're thinking about a decision, there's a trade-off between time and accuracy. Mostly, not always, because some decisions are simple enough. But for complex decisions. So this is different than, let me just say, it's different than a complicated decision. A complicated decision is a chess problem. It's solvable. Right? So that would be where you could actually know exactly what the bins look like. But when you're in the subjective world where there's lots of hidden information, it's complex, right? We need people to get better at understanding that when you're dealing with complex problems, that there's a real trade-off between time and accuracy, that you can take more time and maybe get yourself some more accuracy, right? Or you can sacrifice some accuracy in order to save time. And understanding that balance, when should you act quickly? When should you sort of stick around and say, actually, I should take my time and I should try to see what the real answer is here, depends on what that time is going to buy you. Because if you're not acting quickly enough, it actually changes what the range of possible outcomes is.
Well, it changes how much that hedge costs, right? Exactly what you were talking about earlier. It changes how much
the hedge costs, right? Because as you get closer up on it, the hedge costs a lot more. Yeah. So I think people need to be better at sort of balancing those two things. Like how how valuable is the time to me?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not. There's some decisions where you could linger on it for a year. Who cares? There's other decisions where you just better go and you're willing to sacrifice the accuracy in order to get there, because the impact of not acting is just really high.
Right.
So I think that's number one, is that we need to get people to understand that it's okay to decide when you're not sure. And sometimes it's actually very imperative to decide when you're not sure. That's number one. And then number two is that I think that part of the problem that as decision makers that we have is that the world that we observe is not the world that exists. So what we are looking at is not ground truth. So a very simple example of that is, if I have a coin that's going to flip heads 50% of the time, I might happen to observe a world where it flips heads 5 times in a row. That does not mean that ground truth is that that coin is 100% heads. Okay, so that's like a super simple example of this. So particularly with something like this, where we can sort of look at how ground truth doesn't comport with the observed world in 2 different ways with coronavirus. There's lots of other ways, but let's look at 2 ways. One is the number of cases that you see, because we're not testing 100% of the population, so you have to extrapolate. So when you see 15 cases, there aren't 15 cases in America, and not even close, right?
Yep.
We're probably talking about more than 1 order of magnitude, probably more than that, right? Difference. So we don't really know what that number was at the point that there were 15 cases. The testing was very, very limited at that point. But, some people were saying it might be 50,000 or 100,000 cases at the point that you saw 15. I don't actually know what the answer is. I just know it's a lot more than 15.
Right.
So that's one way where you can see ground truth is not comporting with the world you're observing. So I think at that point, most people were like, it's 15 cases. Like, I'm not in danger. 15 cases out of 350 million. What are the chances I come in contact with someone who has this? So I think that's very hard for people to sort of understand. That's in the vertical sense, right? Like if I look at this moment in time and they're reporting 15 cases, what is ground truth in terms of the number of cases that actually exist? But then there's also the time differential, which is, if I think about what is the world going to look like in 2 weeks, and this is particularly true when you're talking about exponential growth, we tend to be very linear thinkers. So we're thinking there was 15 this week, and there'll be 15 next week, and that'll be 30. And then there'll be 15 the week afterwards, and that'll be 45. And that's sort of the way that our minds tend to work. And when we start asking people to think exponentially in this way, I think it's very challenging. And that's another way where the observed world is not comporting well with ground truth. So ground truth is there's this exponential growth occurring, but we can't actually see it with our own eyes. And I think that that's really hard for people. Then you add on top of that you're asking people to think probabilistically, in the sense that there's a range of possible outcomes. They all have different probabilities. And now we have this interaction of, our actions actually change what those probabilities are going to be. That becomes really, really complex, right? I think it's just a really, really hard problem. And that what I do, in terms of the Alliance for Decision Education, is we've been sounding the alarm, saying we're not educating people well enough to think in this way. We basically dropped probability from the educational system until you get somewhere around college at this point, right?
Yeah.
So
I was trying to explain it to my kids. They are 10 and 14. And just the idea of, because the symptoms are asymptomatic and you can be carrying it, I said, look, it's just when I came back from that business trip, I said, look, I could be a carrier. I could have met somebody on the plane. I could have caught it. I went to a hotel. I stayed at the hotel. I could have transferred it to a person there. Could have gone to go to these meetings. I could have transferred it to the people there. I flew back on the plane. I then went to a banquet that night. Just say I had it and I infected 10 people, and say then those 10 people infected 10 more people. All right. And then those 100 people infected 10 more. And within 5 or 6, we're talking, 100,000 people infected from me, from one. That was this point where, all of a sudden they're like going, oh, that's why I have to wash my hands. That's why I have to do this. And they started to get it. I don't know if they fully got it, but at least
it's enough. Like, we're not great with big numbers.
No.
But that tells them it's a big number.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's what we need to get across. I actually think about, so do you guys remember, because you're the right age for this, the shampoo commercial? And then
you sell 2 friends?
I told 4 people, and they told 4 people, and or 2 people or whatever. And then all of a sudden the
and
screen
they just popped and popped.
I wish we would just have that up.
Yeah.
Like we should just revive that shampoo commercial and say that's coronavirus.
Coronavirus instead, because the end not for it, is a little bit over 2 from what I'm hearing. So like every person that gets it is 2.3 to 3 point something is what they were saying.
3 point something, right?
Yeah.
So let's say, look, when I do these things, I always like to think about the upper bound.
I was looking at the lower bound. There you go. So
right. So I think the upper bound is like 3.4-ish, something like that.
I think so.
So I would rather, again, speaking about hedging, I would rather hedge against the upper bound.
Yeah.
So if it's 3.4 people like that, I want to hedge against that. Right.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it be great if we just had a commercial showing and they infected 3 people and then they infected 3 people, and the speed with which that television screen would get filled up would be so fast.
It's interesting because you talk about, using the upper bound, and I was using the lower bound because I was trying to explain to or convince some people. And what I was using was this idea that, look, even at the worst case or the
best case scenario.
Yeah, best case scenario. Thank you. The best case scenario, given the information that we have today, here's what that would look like.
Yeah.
And even then, it's really, really painful. I mean, the impact that has is significant. So you're looking at this is best case scenario, not even looking at worst case scenario.
Yeah, so I agree. So for the purposes of getting people to act, showing people like even the best case scenario in this case is really, really bad is an amazing strategy. For the purposes of thinking about how might you want to hedge against something, you want to be thinking of the upper
from a policy perspective, right?
From a policy perspective, you want to think about what's the upper bound look like.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm just really sad about is that I feel like there was a missed opportunity for what's really, compared to the national debt, free. And that's the thing that I'm saddest about, is that there was something that we could have done that for all intents and purposes would have been free. The town that it started in, which was not Lombardy, it was another town in Italy, had, I think it was like 3,900 residents. And so because it was 3,900 residents, they could test everybody. So they tested literally 100% of the residents in that town. And they found out, first of all, that 14% were asymptomatic. So that's alarming. But they were able to quarantine those people who wouldn't have otherwise known. They would have continued walking around. So they tested everybody, and then they tested them again maybe after 10 days or something like that. And now guess what? There's no coronavirus in that town because they could isolate the virus. Now, obviously, when you get above numbers like 3,900 people, if you have you can test all of them. Now, South Korea, obviously a lot more people, but they're using that strategy. So they're testing 10,000 people a day. And what they're able to do is start to locate where the carriers are. They did this in China as well. Locate where the carriers are, get them isolated off from everybody. And now what happens is you start to have real cases really drastically diminish. So, obviously they've got millions of people there. Doing the whole population is difficult, but they're doing as close to that as they possibly can get. And you're seeing a lot more success in terms of lowering the curve, right? Really controlling the curve so that you don't end up having that spike. So, and I think that we can think about strategies like that. Like, how would you scale a strategy like that up? So if you have a town of 3,900 people, the strategy is test literally everybody. How do you scale that up? We'll try to get as close to that as a solution as possible. And you're a lot better off. But, obviously in order to do that, you actually have to be, South Korea is testing 10,000 people a day.
Yeah.
So they're able to get control of it a little bit better.
What do you think is, of the new habits that are being created, Annie, what do you think might last beyond the crisis period?
Gosh, that's so hard. I'll take some educated guesses at that. I think the hand washing is going to continue. I don't think we're a huge nation of hand washers before this, but I think that we're going to, have a generation of people who wash like surgeons. They're going to be ready for surgery.
I hope so.
I think Freeroll is going to do really well. So I think that kind of stuff, just like understanding, like when you're touching other people, I think we will go back to shaking hands eventually, but it's going to be shake hands, put Freeroll, let's go. That would be my guess. I don't know, just because of the nature of Americans in general, I don't think masks are going to be something that takes hold. I think that we're, first of all, too individualistic for that. And second of all, so much of the communication is around like, if you're sick, masks are great, but if you're not sick, it's not so helpful. So I don't think that's going to change. And I don't think that standing 6 feet away from people is going to change. For me, my guess is the hand washing. But the other thing that I think is going to change, which I think is really, really important, is that from my understanding, one of the scenarios that occurs over the next 18 months is periods of being out and then periods of social distancing. So these waves. And what I do think is true is that people are going to get it a lot earlier, as people are saying, okay, get back in your house. Okay. I think that people are going to be like, yeah, this isn't a hoax. Let's get inside. And I think that that's really going to help, because obviously the sooner that everybody kind of gets inside, the shorter the period that you have to be inside.
Yeah.
So I do think that is going to change, because we are going to be more attuned to the point of the last disaster that just occurred, which is going to be this one right here. And I think that's really going to change norms around how people respond to the call for social distancing. And there's going to be less like, you're stupid. And I think that's going to be true of millennials as well, because millennials, I don't think, and this isn't millennials, and I'm talking about the people on spring break, right? So I don't think they really understand that this might affect their parents or their grandparents or their aunts, their uncles, those kinds of things. I think they're very much like, I had my spring break. I'm not canceling it. I'm not personally at high risk. And so I'm going to do this. But I think that's going to realize, and I think that you're going to see behavior that's much more collective for the collective good from the younger generation once they actually understand kind of what the consequences of that are. And I think that it's a sad thing, but I think that they're going to have
negative, and these are the negative consequences specifically, right? That you think will influence their behaviors. Huh?
Well, because it creates certainty, right? So right now it's like there's a whole bunch of different things that could happen, and it's not clear, and maybe I'm not going to get sick, and there's a whole bunch of different ways that things could turn out, but it's a lot different once you've actually observed it.
Yeah.
In the same sense that the numbers had to get high enough in order for people to really take it seriously, and stop saying this is just hyped and whatever. And 15 certainly wasn't that number.
Yeah.
Right. So it had to get high enough that there was enough certainty around it that people felt comfortable with changing their behavior. So, all of those spring breakers, because we know statistically some of them will not fare well, right? So we just know that from a statistical standpoint. I don't wish that on anyone. I hope they all survive. I hope everyone survives. I hope all their grandparents survive. I hope all their parents survive. I hope all their aunts and uncles survive. But we know statistically that that's not going to happen. And when they start realizing that, like, my friend got sick and ended up in the ICU, maybe this isn't so safe.
And maybe it was because of me. So, all right, I have one last question for you. So why did people make a run on toilet paper?
Right. So it's the last disaster. So let's talk about New York.
Okay.
So New York, Houston, these are all true weather disasters. Those are the things that we've been observing. Irma, so on and so forth. In those things, it's very hard to get supplies in. Things are flooded. There might be no electricity. Stores can't open because people can't, or you can't get to them. And then you run out of toilet paper. So when you're thinking about what are the lists of things that you would want to have on hand for a hurricane, bottled water is one, because water might be contaminated. Toilet paper is one, because supply chains will be disrupted for some period of time where you need to have toilet paper. You may not be able to get to the store or whatever. And so those are the kinds of things that you're going to have on hand besides the food.
Right.
But in this particular case, at least not for now, it could happen in the future. Supply chains aren't really that disrupted. Yeah. So you can get toilet paper, and our water is not contaminated. So you can get water out of the tap. But I do think it's that same thing. It's like Asia, which has not experienced the hurricanes in the same way that we have, they were ready for SARS. Mm-hmm. They were ready for something that looked like SARS. So they're all walking around with masks. They've got lots and lots of hospital beds. They have fever rooms, as you pointed out, all sorts of really strict quarantine in place, ramped up for testing at any second. Like, they're ready for that one. We're ready for Irma. Mm-hmm. And so when people are like, "Oh, a really bad thing's going to happen," people go look at what's my disaster list, like what, and that's what that was coming from. People were like, "You need toilet paper."
Well, and then for people in the Midwest where it still happens and we don't experience a hurricane, I think there's that herd mentality. It's like, oh, everybody's, going out and getting toilet paper. I got to go get toilet paper. And it's more of it's going to be out before I get it. So I better go get it. Right.
Yeah. Well, then there's certainly it's a little game theory problem, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So you get a little game theory problem in there as well. Like if everybody's doing it, then if I wait too long, I won't even be able to get one roll.
Yeah.
And also there are lists that are available online, like what's your disaster preparedness supposed to be? And obviously toilet paper and bottled water was on there. So, so I think that's probably where that was coming from, but at least for now, Amazon is still operating. So you should be able to get toilet paper delivered to you. That being said, I would still make sure I have some on hand, not 20 million rolls, but just in case, thinking about, keep your eye out in case it looks like supply chains might get disrupted. Then you would want to treat it more like you're in a hurricane situation.
The interesting thing, we talked with Christian Hunt earlier, who does some risk elements and different things. And he's the one thing that was interesting that he said about this question, because we asked him as well, was there's other things that are more important if you are actually in a situation where you can't get out and you grab those. You can still defecate, and there are other alternatives to using toilet paper to do that. And so, from an actual like necessary need, and I hear your point of, yes, it's the last, accident or disaster, and it's the way that we do it, but it really doesn't make rational sense if we actually think about it. But it was.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that what I would say is, like, one of the things that I always try to be careful with by talking about things being rational or not rational is to take into account what someone's values are.
That's true.
Right. And most of us have lived a life where we can use toilet paper.
Yep.
And the other things that you can do are not nearly as convenient. They're, but I think it is like, I think particularly in these times, it's a trade-off, right? It's like, how much are you spending? Like, what is the capital that you're spending, whatever capital that might be, which is not just money, in order to have toilet paper, versus like, what are your values in terms of feeling like this is the normal thing I do and I don't have to veer from what I normally do. And so I actually would not be in the camp of saying that was irrational behavior, personally.
Buying 30 packets of it and...
Well, that might be misestimating what the risk is. But assuming that was your estimate of what the risk is, you might be... again, we're talking about subjective probabilities, and people are going to be, the thing I don't want to ever do is say, if you knew what the objective truth was, here's what rational behavior is. So the fact that you didn't act in that way means that you're not rational. It's like, well, look, these things are subjective, and there's all sorts of information that you don't have. And some people aren't going to be calculating those probabilities so well. So what I want to know is, what was your calculation of the risk?
You're right.
Because if I understand what your calculation of the risk was, you may have actually acted perfectly rational in the face of your calculation. That just means your model, right? What you value. And it may just be that your model of the world was kind of off, but that's a wholly different problem, right? That's a completely different problem than, are you being rational?
That's true.
Right. Where you can get into irrationality is like, look, at the worst case scenarios, you need like 10 rolls. And for some reason you decide to go get 300, right? Yeah. I mean, assuming that you're not going to be the guy with the garage full of Purell and you just want the 300 for yourself. That's a little weird in terms of your spending of the capital. But I assume, I'm assuming that those people were acting rational given what they thought the world was going to look like. Let's put it that way.
Very, very well said. So
we want to thank you, as always, for your time, for your insight, for your passion, for your critical thinking, for just being you.
Oh, well, right back at you. And I am so sorry that we didn't get to have Lila with us, who...
We'll make it happen. So we will make that happen at some point, and it will be fantastic.
Yeah, and...
Welcome to the special edition grooving session, where Tim and I groove on some of the key ideas and concepts that were sparked by our conversation with Annie Duke. All right, Tim, what did Annie spark with you in this conversation?
Oh, so much. It was a great conversation. We covered lots and lots of stuff. Way fun. But let's start with hedging.
Oh, hedging.
Okay, so for me, when Annie gave the analogy that hedging is like insurance, that crystallized it for me.
Yeah.
It's like you don't buy insurance. You don't call up the insurance agency and say, "Oh, I think that my house is on fire, so I better get some insurance." No, you actually plan for it. You get ahead of the curve. You actually say, "I'm going to be intentional about something that hopefully won't happen." Hopefully, I'll never have to use it. And yet I'm going to buy the insurance anyway, just in case.
And this idea that we are not good at hedging, right? She said that people really don't understand hedging very well. And the idea that we don't like it as well. And I think part of that goes into this idea that we're paying for something now for this potential payoff in the future, even though we don't know if we're ever going to have to, get paid off by that hedge.
Well, and this is akin to hyperbolic discounting then, right? Because we're looking out at that future and we're saying that's just worth less than the things that are happening right now.
Well, and part of it is the pain of paying right now, the pain of paying
it's immediate.
today, right? Yeah. Because that's immediate. That's a loss aversion. So that $50 that I'm paying today for that insurance, or that $100 or that $1,000, whatever it would be, is now. It's immediate. It's a loss. It's something I can't go to the store and buy some books, or I can't do something else with that $50, and that's gone. Now, with coronavirus, it's this idea that we didn't hedge enough, particularly the government did not hedge enough in advance of this. And I thought that was a really interesting piece, particularly as she related it to this idea of a free roll. And basically the government could have hedged with a free roll, because the amount that they would have had to spend to get, increased testing kits, or maybe say, let's order, 5,000, 10,000 ventilators. Let's do some of the stuff, is so minute compared to the overall budget that it literally is a decimal misplace.
But it gets more expensive the longer you wait.
It gets more expensive.
Way expensive.
More expensive in terms of lives impacted and lost, and the economic impact that this is having across the nation and across the world. I mean, when you have to shelter at home because the virus has gotten out of control, because we didn't have enough testing kits to test enough people in order to quarantine them because they had the virus in advance, then you're running into these, huge costs that have come up and are taking place as what we're seeing right now.
It's also very real costs when you think about the cost of what these masks, for instance, the physicians and healthcare providers need to wear. Apparently used to cost less than $1.
Yeah.
And now, because of the tremendous demand, can be going for as much as $7.50.
Yeah. And
this is crazy, right? And so this is where, if the government would have been buying them all along, they could have been buying them for less than $1 a piece.
Yeah. So
but now that lack of planning is really getting in the way.
She also brought up this element that we regret hedges that don't come that don't pay out. So she used the example of getting the tent for your wedding, and if it doesn't, in case it rains, because you want to have an outdoor wedding, and if it doesn't rain, you regret that purchase of that tent. And I think there's something that goes into that regret. We anticipate that regret that we're going to have. We anticipate the likelihood that we are going to have to use this hedge. And I think one of the aspects around coronavirus that happened early on, and part of the reason that maybe some of these hedges didn't happen, is we thought about the regret that would happen from that. But we also looked at this as the likelihood of something happening. And so the likelihood of a fatality of this is still relatively low when you look at the larger scale for any individual, right? I mean, granted, there are higher at risk populations, but in general, it's under 2%, I believe, at this point. Again, that changes every day, so don't quote me on that. But the fact of the matter is that the communication that went out was, this is really not that likely to happen to us. And so to hedge, you have to believe that there's a likelihood of something happening. And I think that played into this.
Oftentimes, this story continues to come back to planning and getting ahead of the curve, saying we anticipate that even though there are very small percentages of likelihood of some things happening, it really would pay off big time if we made a hedge right now and made an investment in something that, even though it has a small likelihood of occurring, could still have a huge potential for negative impact on us.
So Annie in Thinking in Bets talks about doing premortems, right? Where you anticipate potential outcomes and then you look back from those and what did you do in order to achieve those outcomes? And I think that's something to this, right? The likelihood is really small, but the consequences could be disastrous, right? It's those black swan kind of elements that come into play. The facet that I think is really interesting in this, not really interesting. I think there's a part of this that's really interesting to look back on this and say, why didn't we place the hedges either as individuals and or as a society, governmental pieces? But now there's an opportunity for us to say, what are the hedges I need to put in place today?
Mm-hmm.
Looking forward 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year. What are some of those things that I should be doing premortems on to know? Because as you said, hedges get more expensive or even impossible to do as time goes on. And the closer that it comes. So we have to start looking in advance. And so one of the things that I started to do with my wife, and this was actually as a result of both Barry Ritholtz's interview and Annie's interview. Barry talked about planning and putting plans in place for when things happen, is we started to think about, all right, so if this goes on for 3 months, if this goes on for 6 months, what are some of the things that we need to be doing today in order to say 3 months from now, we're not going, oh, I wish we would have started doing this 3 months ago or 6 months looking like if we only would have done this, 6 months ago, we would have been
things
so
would be
much
better
better
now.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that I'm taking from this.
You also had some other thoughts about this, right?
Well, I had about the whole conversation.
Yeah, about the whole conversation.
The idea of the last disaster syndrome.
Oh, isn't that such a great image?
Oh, well, it just makes sense. And her idea, again, using that as the rationale for people buying toilet paper, I'm going, oh, yeah, that makes sense, because our last disaster in the United States is typically this, it's hurricanes. And so then you look back to whatever that last disaster was to assess how to respond in the current or upcoming disaster. I think that goes to explain a lot of our response, a lot of Europe's response and our response relative to some of the responses that you see happening in Asian countries, where there's been probably a more concerted and better effort at containing the coronavirus to some degree. And again, that's changing all the time. But you look at Taiwan, you look at Korea, South Korea, you look at Singapore, you look at those where their last disaster was around,
was a virus.
Was a virus.
Was medical.
And they had plans in place and understood that their reference point was that last virus.
It's also, for me, it's also worth pointing out that while there are some analogical things that we can take from this, it's not, what we're going through right now is not World War II.
No.
It's not 9/11.
No.
It's not the last hurricane. It's not AIDS.
No.
This is wholly unique in so many ways that it's got to be hard for all of us to get our head around something that was anticipatable. And we didn't get our hedge properly to get ready for it. And here we are in something that really isn't all that similar to all these major disasters that we've had in the last century.
And yet it's impacted us severely. I mean, I look at this as the amount of actual behavior change that this is driving across the board. And there is nothing like this in my lifetime. I mean, nothing that is comparable. And so you look at that and you're going, the impact that this has had, and to the degree that we did not hedge for this, because some of those aspects I think is really, really quite insightful as to how bad we are at hedging and how bad we are at, and some of the reasons is we compared this to the last disaster we had, and this is not comparable. And so it's able to identify what are some of those really impactful things that could be coming down the line, and we just have to prepare for them better. So,
yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about Annie's comment about how it's okay to make decisions when we're unsure.
Right. Well, this whole topic of making decisions in uncertainty. So, yeah, making decisions when you're unsure. What caught you in that?
It's good to be reminded that it is okay to make decisions under uncertainty as long as it's paired with, and we'll continue to adapt our decisions as we get new information. As this came out in our conversation with James Brewer about continuing to learn and continuing to adapt. And Liz Fosseline talked about being intentional. I feel like this all kind of ties together in this story of go ahead and make a decision and be open to continuing to make changes and updating that as we go.
Right. And Annie made the distinction that, the more certainty you get, it's a cost of time. And some decisions need to have a time horizon that is much faster than our ability to get that information. And so we just have to make a decision with uncertainty, and we have to feel okay about making that decision with uncertainty. And yes, we could be wrong. We could make a wrong assumption. We could not know all of the underlying causes and factors that go into play, and it may not be the optimal solution, but there is this idea that we need to take action. And if we have to take action quick, it comes at the cost of knowledge and certainty.
Right. She went on to say that the world that we observe is not the world that exists.
Oh, right. I love that. It's not the ground truth, right?
Right.
It's not the truth that's on the ground. And which gets into, and again, it's kind of a poetic way of saying this, but we don't know a whole bunch of things that are going on all the time, particularly when we're dealing with humans and we're dealing in subjective cases. She brought up the idea of, chess is a perfectly knowable thing, but the rest of life isn't, right?
Very complex.
Very complex.
And yet, it makes me think of Danny Kahneman's comment that what you see is all there is, that we are so good as humans of ignoring and, just if it's not in front of us, then it's not real.
Yeah.
And this is one of the opportunities we have for change, to change the way that we live our lives because of this crisis, is to start thinking about, guess what? There is more out there than what's straight in front of our faces.
Right. And I'll go back even to our ability to exponentially think, right? And our math skills. And so we do these back of the napkins mathematical equations and go, oh, it's 2%. That doesn't, I'm lucky, I'll take that risk or less than that. And we don't understand the larger scale consequences, like we talked with Rod Wagner on, is that it's the cumulative probability. And then when you multiply that by the number of people in society, the exponential math that's associated with that is something that we're not good at. So again, that viewpoint of what we see is what reality is. If our heads aren't doing that math, then our reality isn't taking that into consideration as well.
Yeah, the difference between 0.1% mortality rate with influenza A and a 1%, even a 1% mortality rate with coronavirus, is the difference between 63,000 people dying and 630,000 people dying.
Yeah.
It's huge. So it may sound like 0.1%, 1%, whatever. Hundreds of thousands of people's lives are at stake with those small changes in numbers.
Yeah. If you think about how we make decisions, and the fact of the matter is you and I do this. Everybody listening does this, is we make decisions oftentimes very quickly. It's our system one taking place. Those decisions are influenced by biases, by heuristics, by the context that we're in, by what we've heard right before it, how we're feeling that day, all of the emotional aspects that go into our lives. And sometimes those decisions are fantastic. In situations that require non-status quo decisions, they're not as well suited for those that quick thinking, and
they're hard,
they're hard. And I mean, that was a whole nother aspect of her talk that was interesting, is the status quo versus non-status quo, and the impact that those have, and how hard it is to do non-status quo, and the 2x2 grid she talked about. But
it's terrific. Yeah.
All of that comes into play when we're making these decisions in this world where even today, the reality is changing hour by hour, day by day. And we have to stay on top of things, and that's hard. It's emotionally draining, as well as just cognitively hard to keep updating our belief sets and our knowledge around this, because we have to, though, because the consequences of this are so potentially dire, and we need to do that. Thank you for listening to the special episode of Behavioral Grooves. We hope that you found it interesting and insightful. If you liked it, please let others know. We think that the topic is important, and maybe we can help in educating people about how behavioral science can help us all out in this current craziness that we are going through.
Also, please let us know if you have any thoughts or ideas that would be helpful or that we could share. You can reach us through the Connect tab on the Behavioral Grooves website at www.behavioralgrooves.com, or through Twitter. I'm at @THoulihan and Kurt is at @WhatMotivates. We really do love hearing from you, and this topic is one that spurs lots of emotions and thought.
As part of our mission, we want to expand and inform the community of people who think about positively applying behavioral science to life. One way that happens is through leaving reviews. If you think this podcast is beneficial and should grow, we would really appreciate to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcast server you use.
It only takes a few minutes and goes a long way to boost us in the algorithms that are used to generate search results.
Also, please check out the show notes. We are linking to a number of resources, articles, podcasts, newsletters that we've vetted to bring good facts and ideas around COVID-19 and the coronavirus, its impact, and ways that we can help slow down the spread. There is a lot of information that's being pushed out to everyone each day, and we are weeding through it to find good stuff so that you don't have to.
We truly appreciate you listening. Now go out and wash your hands.